A strange journey through time. Back in 2004, I was living with a friend in England. We often took long walks through the countryside, exploring fields and wooded areas whenever we could. One day, during one of our usual hikes, we noticed a small cluster of trees near the edge of a field, a sort of miniature forest that seemed out of place. Intrigued, we decided to check it out. As we approached, we noticed a narrow pathway cutting through the trees, almost hidden. Curiosity got the best of us, so we followed it. As we walked along, the trees began to curve overhead, forming a sort of natural archway above the path. The further we went, the more surreal it became. The branches seemed to intertwine perfectly, like they were deliberately growing to create this tunnel. It was as though the forest itself had guided us into a mysterious corridor. We continued down this tunnel-like path for what felt like ages, probably half an hour, when finally we saw daylight ahead. We stepped out of the archway into what looked, at first glance, like more open countryside. But something was off. In front of us was a settlement that defied explanation. The buildings looked like they were cobbled together from scraps and wooden debris, almost like a village made from salvaged parts. And then there were the people. Tiny figures, no more than 4 or 5 feet tall, were moving around dressed in ragged clothes and covered in mud. Their eyes locked on us with intense, unblinking stares, as if they'd never seen anyone like us before. We must have looked as foreign to them as they did to us. There was no sign of modern life. No roads, no power lines, nothing. Just a muddy path winding through the center of the village. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. A kind of instinctual alarm telling me we shouldn't be there. I turned to my friend and said, "We need to leave. Now." My friend thankfully didn't argue. We retraced our steps, hurrying back through the archway of trees. Looking back, I can't help but regret that it happened in 2004, before smartphones and easy access to cameras. There was no way to document what we saw. In the months that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that place, and eventually, I persuaded my friend to go back with a digital camera. When we returned, we found the same trees and what looked like the same entrance. But this time, the path only lasted a few minutes, before leading out into a perfectly ordinary field. We walked around the perimeter of the grove, only to find it was just a small square of undeveloped land, surrounded by the usual farmland. There was no archway, no village. There was nothing to photograph. To this day, I'm convinced that if we hadn't left when we did, we might still be there. Wherever or whenever there is. Another missing persons report, lost in a time slip. The wedding. Today, reality shifted in a way I can't quite grasp. My teen and I were supposed to be at a wedding, but something strange happened. The bride, my coworker, was the first person I talked to this morning. Maybe my nerves got the best of me, but I think I came on a bit strong. I hadn't expected sharing this whole experience here to make me feel this unsettled, but here we are. Right away, something was off. I brought up all those conversations we'd had about her stepmother, the arguments about why the wedding had to be on a weekday, a Thursday of all things. How she and her fiancé had chosen February 15th because it had special meaning. In both of their families, beloved relatives shared that same anniversary, and they saw it as a sign for their own marriage, a perfect alignment of love and family tradition. I can still remember her irritation with her stepmom's endless objections. It felt like her future mother-in-law just couldn't let it go. I listened to the whole saga over countless work chats and venting sessions, but today, she just blinked at me, clearly confused. She remembered not being fond of her stepmom, but she couldn't recall any conflict over the date. The reason they'd chosen it, the sentimentality that had caused so much tension, none of it seemed to register. When I asked her why February 15th was so significant, she paused, looking almost blank. She didn't seem to remember ever telling me that story. As I was talking to her, I reached for our chat history, looking for some trace of those conversations. Nothing. Just messages about caterers and venues. All the stress and drama from the date debate had simply vanished. When I mentioned it, she shrugged, dismissing it as, "I must have told you at some point. How else would you know?" From her perspective, her wedding has always been on a weekend date in the future, and this weekday wedding I was so sure of had simply never existed. It was bizarre, and if it weren't for my teenager, I would have questioned my own memory. But my teen was there with me through all of this. They remembered the date as clearly as I did. They'd read it out loud when we first received the invite, had double-checked it on our family calendar, and even confirmed it that morning. Everything seemed to be leading to today. The RSVP had been sent months ago, and the invitation was pinned to the fridge. I'd arranged my work schedule around it, taking a half day off to attend. It was all planned out, until it wasn't. This morning, I saw the bride's absence from work as a sweet sign she was enjoying her wedding day. My teen got home from school early, we grabbed the invitation off the fridge, punched in the venue address on my phone, and prepared to head out. We hit a snag, a massive traffic jam blocking the route. But we figured we'd still make it, just a bit late. As we were about to leave, my phone pinged, a message from the bride. She casually mentioned she'd just finished up at a job site and was signing off for the day. She'd worked through lunch and planned to catch up tomorrow morning, like any other workday. No wedding, no Thursday ceremony, nothing. Stunned, I picked up the invite again. My heart stopped. The date had changed. It was now set for a weekend, a date that had never been there before. I checked my work portal to see my time off request. Gone, as if I'd never filed it. Yet my memory, my teen's memory, and all those conversations told a different story. My teen, wide-eyed and speechless, confirmed what they'd seen over and over. They had read that Thursday date aloud. We talked about it all week, right down to today, a Thursday. Some have asked if I checked for gas leaks or CO2 levels, and I appreciate the concern. All detectors are fine, and we've got fresh air flowing through the house. But as it stands, it feels like the world restitched itself, leaving no sign of what we'd once known. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a glitch. It was a full rewrite of events that only my teen and I seem to remember. Today was supposed to be the day of the wedding, and yet somehow that reality no longer exists. I am shaken to my core. I think I stepped into a parallel universe. It happened when I was around 18 or 19, but I remember it vividly, as if it was yesterday. How jarring, how completely wrong it felt. I'm usually a skeptical person, but this experience shakes me to this day. I think for a moment I might have stepped into a parallel universe. It was the middle of a summer afternoon, maybe 1 or 2 p.m. I was still living at home in my childhood house, the only home I'd ever known since we moved in when I was 3. Going for a walk in the nearby park was a ritual of mine. I'd been doing it almost daily since I was around 14. Everything about that routine felt normal, comforting, even mundane. That day, I slipped on my shoes, opened the front door, and stepped outside. But the moment I looked up, something was off. My neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. Our steep driveway, the tree in our front yard, the small ravine next to the house, and even the neighboring homes. But everything felt wrong. It was as though reality itself was out of tune, like seeing your reflection in a funhouse mirror, only the mirror was invisible. I stood there on the porch, just staring, trying to pinpoint what felt so twisted. I told myself it was just a weird feeling, and forced myself to head down the driveway, hoping the sensation would fade if I just ignored it. But as I was making my way down, I noticed my neighbor across the street. He was tending to his garden, but when he looked up and saw me, his face drained of color, and he froze as if he'd just seen a ghost. Our eyes met, and his mouth opened as if he was about to say something. But before I could react, before he could utter a word, I was back inside the house. I was at the front door, just as I'd been moments before, my hand on the doorknob, about to leave. I stood there, stunned. I had no memory of turning around or walking back inside. It was as if I'd blinked, and the entire last few minutes vanished, dropping me back to square one. Everything felt glaringly normal now. The odd feeling had vanished, as if it had never existed. I hesitated, opened the door again, and looked outside. Nothing was wrong this time. The neighborhood looked and felt just as it should, familiar and safe. The only difference? My neighbor wasn't there anymore. His yard was empty, no sign of him or his startled expression. I didn't go for my walk that day. Years later, the memory still haunts me. The strangest part wasn't even the inexplicable reset back to the doorway or my neighbor's reaction. It was that overwhelming sense of wrongness, like I was staring at a version of my neighborhood that was almost, but not quite my own. It wasn't dread, and I didn't feel in danger, but it was deeply unsettling. I had been looking at something that was perfectly normal on the surface, yet so fundamentally skewed that I knew I didn't belong there. I'll never forget that feeling, like I had brushed up against some invisible boundary in reality and accidentally slipped through. The man from an unknown country. On a sweltering day in July 1954, a man arrived at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, having just disembarked from a European flight. He appeared entirely unremarkable at first, well-dressed and carrying himself with ease. Like any other traveler, he made his way to customs, blending into the flow of people around him. However, as the customs officer inspected his passport, something unusual caught his attention. The man's passport, while authentic-looking, claimed he was from a country called Taurid, a nation that the Japanese authorities had never heard of. The traveler, unperturbed, insisted that Taurid was a real country, and stated this was his third visit to Japan. When questioned, the man confidently pointed to his country's supposed location on a map. He indicated an area nestled between France and Spain, precisely where the small principality of Andorra lies. Yet he seemed genuinely baffled when he saw Andorra labeled on the map instead of Taurid, stating that Taurid had existed there for over 1,000 years. Further investigation revealed even more baffling details. The traveler carried currencies from several European countries, as well as a passport filled with stamps from various international airports, including past visits to Tokyo. Convinced of a potential fraud, the Japanese authorities detained him for further questioning, deciding he should remain in custody overnight for additional checks. During this time, the officials attempted to verify his story. They called the company he claimed to work for, but nobody there had ever heard of him. Next, they contacted the hotel he had booked, only to discover they had no record of his reservation. Even the bank that had issued his checks seemed to be non-existent. The man was placed under guard in a nearby hotel to ensure he couldn't simply slip away. Yet, by the next morning, he had vanished without a trace. His room was several floors up with no balcony, and there was no conceivable way he could have escaped unnoticed. Officers rushed to check his belongings, but they too had disappeared, including every document that mentioned Taurid. The mystery of the man from Taurid left officials grasping for explanations. Some speculated he was a covert government agent equipped with professionally forged documents, with the country of Taurid invented as part of his cover. They imagined an elaborate extraction plan that allowed him to vanish without a trace. Others believed he might have come from a parallel universe where Taurid actually existed, in place of Andorra. According to this theory, when he realized his predicament, he somehow slipped back to his own dimension, reclaiming his documents in the process. Some even suggested he could be a time traveler from a distant future, when Andorra might one day become Taurid. Of course, skeptics argue the story might have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated over the years. Regardless, the legend of the man from Taurid endures as one of the most captivating tales of unexplained mysteries. The disappearing time traveler. In 1995, a man named Mike Markham from Stanberry, Missouri, set out to do something extraordinary. Obsessed with the mysteries of time travel, Markham attempted to construct a time machine in his own home. It was an audacious project, one that would later captivate local residents and attract media attention, but it came with a fair share of danger and intrigue. Markham's fascination with time travel began as a young adult, spurred on by his interest in science and electricity. He believed that he could create a time portal using a device called a Jacob's ladder, which generates an electric arc between two metal rods. When electricity jumps between the rods, it creates a crackling climbing spark, a dramatic effect often used in science fiction movies. Markham, however, was interested in more than just theatrics. He believed that under the right conditions, he could generate enough energy to open a doorway to another point in time. Determined to see his theory through, Markham set up his Jacob's ladder and began experimenting with various forms of electricity, even modifying the device with parts he scavenged from junkyards. His initial experiments yielded promising results, but he soon realized he needed more power to sustain the arc long enough to potentially create a time vortex. According to local accounts, he rigged up parts of old transformers and other electronic equipment, channeling increasingly dangerous amounts of power through his makeshift machine. As Markham continued with his experiments, strange things began happening. Neighbors reported seeing flashes of light and hearing crackling sounds coming from his property. Some even claimed they saw peculiar distortions in the air around his machine, as though reality itself was bending. Then came the fateful day when Markham ramped up his machine to full power. According to his own account, he decided to try a daring experiment. He placed a small piece of metal within the arc of his Jacob's ladder, hoping to observe some kind of effect. The piece of metal reportedly vanished, as if swallowed up by an invisible portal. Encouraged by this result, he escalated his ambitions. What happened next remains one of the strangest parts of the story. Shortly after this experiment in 1997, Markham himself went missing and was never heard from again, leaving him at the center of one of the biggest time travel mysteries. Shortly after he vanished, a listener on the radio show called in to talk about a bizarre story he had found. In the 1930s, cops found a dead man on a beach in California. The listener said, "The man was crushed to death in a strange metal tube, and a mysterious device was found near his body, which looked very much like a mobile phone." Sunset Boulevard. I was 25 when it happened. I was driving home late one night, heading down a curvy stretch of Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. It was one of those quiet nights where the city feels almost peaceful. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Out of nowhere, the car in front of me spun out of control, skidding across the lane and blocking my path. I barely had time to react. To my right, another car kept me boxed in, and I had nowhere to escape. I didn't think. I just swerved, first right, then left, trying desperately to avoid the collision. That's when a strange memory hit me. A vivid flashback to a trip I'd taken with my mom to Disney World years ago. The memory was so intense, but it was a detail I'd never consciously remembered before. As I swerved wildly, a feeling washed over me. A deep, gut-wrenching certainty that this was it. My life was flashing before my eyes, and I was about to die. I heard myself screaming, "No, no, this isn't fair, not yet." My hands were clenching the wheel, and I felt the whole world collapsing in on me. Then, everything stopped. The cars were gone. The road was empty, and I was sitting alone on Sunset Boulevard. For a moment, I just stared ahead, stunned. I couldn't understand what had happened. I half expected to see wreckage behind me, but there was nothing. I cautiously started driving again, glancing in every direction as if the chaos might come rushing back at any moment. But it didn't. The entire way home, I didn't see a single car. Sunset Boulevard on a Saturday night was empty, eerily, impossibly empty. When I finally got home, the street outside my apartment was deserted too. I sat in my car for a minute, trying to ground myself, feeling like I might slip out of reality if I let my guard down. I stumbled inside and grabbed my phone, calling a friend, just to hear someone else's voice. I needed to know I was real, that I was alive. I asked her to reassure me, even though I wasn't sure she could understand what I meant. Since that night, I can't shake the feeling that I was never supposed to make it home. Logically, there was no way out of that situation. I should have crashed. There was no room to avoid it. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I actually died on that road, and that my life since then has been something else. Some kind of strange afterlife, or a very vivid death dream. part of me still wonders if, in some way, I'm lying on Sunset Boulevard, reliving my life in the moments before everything went black. My Aunt Laura. When I was a kid, I was told about my great Aunt Laura, my maternal grandfather's sister. She had passed away from heart issues in 2000, 3 years before I was born. I was able to understand the concept of death dying from a very young age, so I understood that she passed away and that I would never meet her. I'd seen her pictures and knew her face well, but it was always clear to me she was part of the past. Then, something strange happened around 2014 or 2015. We were at a family gathering when my mom introduced me to someone, saying, "This is your Aunt Laura." I stared, speechless, recognizing the face instantly. It was the same woman I'd seen in all the photos. Confused, I blurted out that I thought she had passed away before I was even born. My aunt and my mom both looked puzzled. After a few awkward moments of conversation, I brushed it off and went back to hanging out with my cousins, but the incident left me shaken. Years later, at 18, I finally asked my mom about it again. I wanted to know if she remembered introducing me to Aunt Laura that day. But to my surprise, she had no recollection of it at all, as though it had never happened. Now in my early 20s, I'm still haunted by that experience. I sometimes wonder if I somehow crossed into a different reality, a parallel universe where my great aunt had been alive that day.